Hello there and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about dynamic ground mounts. Yeah, dynamic ground mounts apparently coming to World of Warcraft, or at least some indication that this might be happening. Some pretty interesting stuff was data mined at the start of 10.25. I've been looking into it and there's some pretty curious stuff that I wanted to talk about in this video. But before we jump into that, guys, I just want to shout out my Twitch, twitch.tv/MrGM. If you want to see me stream World of Warcraft, Dragonflight PTR, and more, I'm over on twitch.tv/MrGM every single day. Right, so yeah, dynamic ground mounts might be coming to World of Warcraft in the future. Quite a lot of data in the files seems to indicate this. At least someone was playing around with it, and some pretty interesting things were certainly found. Now, if you don't know, dynamic flight is the new name for dragon riding. So dynamic and dragon riding, essentially kind of the same thing. So kind of picture it like dragon riding on the ground, pretty much. Now, dynamic ground mounts are not a new concept in gaming. I believe Guild Wars 2 does something similar to this. Not sure about other games, but there's certainly not a new concept, but definitely an interesting concept that could really work in World of Warcraft. Now, obviously in the World Within, we are getting dynamic flying mounts as a default, so that's going to be really interesting to see. We will still have static flying, but dynamic flight is going to be something that we're going to be using a lot in that expansion. Now, the idea of dynamic ground mounts would obviously be dragon riding on the ground with vigor and abilities and things like that, and there is some data to suggest that that is possibly something we might see in the future. So let's talk about the data. What is in the data and what's the story here behind the dynamic ground mounts? So let's take you back to the first build of patch 10.25, Seeds of Renewal. This patch was listed as patch 10.25.52206. Had some really interesting stuff in it, which was later removed in future PTR builds. So that's where it gets really interesting. So, data miners discovered there was a new mount in the game files. This mount was called Prototype Dynamic Ground Mount, DNT. Now, DNT could stand for a lot of things. I think it might be Do Not Test. I'm not too sure there. Any programmers in the comments? I'm not sure. DNT is listed on a lot of things in World of Warcraft. Now, this mount is an exact copy of the Mechacycle Model W from Mechagon. So it has the same model and description as that mount. However, it is listed as mount type 431. Now, mount type 431 is not used by any other mounts. Now, the kind of short version of how mount type works is that it's a number that goes into another database file, which has different capabilities. These could be, flight or epic ground mount or standard ground mount, and these are the different capabilities that this mount can do. Now, the three capabilities that mount type 431 can do is epic ground mount, which we see on a lot of mounts, standard ground mount, again, something we see on a lot of mounts, and one that's listed as dynamic mount movement, and this is not used by any other mounts. The capability ID of dynamic mount movement is connected to a spell. This spell is 422602, and this is dynamic mount movement. Now, this is an instant spell, and the description of this is that it enables dynamic ground movement mechanics when applied. Yeah, and the buff that you get when this is active is that it enables dynamic ground mount movement mechanics while applied. So yeah, a pretty interesting spell. This spell is not used by any other mount. This is literally just this one test mount used the dynamic mount movement spell, which is linked directly to dynamic ground mount. It literally says it in the description of this spell, which is super interesting. Now, this spell was removed along with the dynamic prototype mount. So yeah, what does that tell you? Probably that it was a test thing and they removed it just because people were snooping too much. But that is removed. It has been removed from the game. You cannot link it in game. It was removed in the next patch 10.25 PTR build. Now, staying with spells here, there are a couple other spells which might link to dynamic mount movement. So the first one is Thrill of the Wild. Now, this is obviously kind of similar to Thrill of the Skies. This is an instant spell, and the description of this is that it regenerates vigor every 5 seconds and increases mount movement speed by 100%. So basically, Thrill of the Skies for the ground? Pretty much. The buff for this says regenerating vigor every 5 seconds and mounted movement speed is increased by 100%. So what is that? What is Thrill of the Wild? Is it Thrill of the Skies with ground mount movement. It definitely certainly seems like it. Yeah, very interesting spell indeed. I don't think this was removed though, unlike some of the other things that were listed, but Thrill of the Wild definitely seems like something that is linked to dynamic mount movement. The other ability is Jump Dash Keybound Override. Now this was found by data miner Marlamin, so Jump Dash could potentially be an ability that a dynamic mount would do. I did scour through the entire list of new spells that were added in that first build, and Thrill of the Wilds was the one that I found, and Jump Dash, as mentioned, was found previously. So two potential abilities that could link directly to dynamic mount movement. So super interesting there, some very early kind of indications that that is something they definitely were working on, but could it be a test? Could it be something they're messing around with? Who knows? So there's one other thing that happened as well, which was also removed in that second build. So there was a map ID. Now this is called James's Dynamic Mount Test Ground DNT. The map ID for this was 2675, and this map is an exact duplicate of the Azuramis Isles, which is super random. Even more random was that the loading screen for this map was a random loading screen from the Assault of Zan Ves. Yeah, very strange. So this is essentially just an area, presumably where they were testing these dynamic ground mounts, because it's quite a flat area. Obviously, doesn't allow flying in that area either. So pretty, pretty perfect map. Now, interesting enough, as mentioned, this was removed on that second build as well. So not too sure what's going on with that. Obviously, can't dive into the map or anything like that, but we do know that it is a copy of the Azuramis Isle, and that's pretty much it. So that's kind of what's going on with that. So that's basically everything we know about dynamic ground mounts, kind of the data mine data that we have right now. I'd love to look back on this in like 5 years and we're like, oh my goodness, that was everything that was kind of there, and it was building up to it. Definitely something I would like to see in World of Warcraft if done correctly. Dynamic flight, dragon riding is super fun. I could definitely see how they could maneuver that into a dynamic ground mount style. Would love to see what the, ideas are for that. What are your thoughts on this data mine data? Would you like to see dynamic ground mounts? Yeah, let me know down below. There's a lot of potential here. But obviously data mine data, be data mining, right? Like it's test data, it's whatever, right? But it's good to speculate. It's fun to speculate and talk about these things and get excited over stuff that will probably never happen. But yes, thank you very much for watching, guys. If you like this video, please do leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to support me outside of YouTube, I'm also on Patreon and I'm on Twitter at MrGMYT, and I have a partner Discord channel as well. And as mentioned, I am streaming on twitch.tv/MrGM. If you want to see me stream World of Warcraft, Dragonflight PTR, and more, I'm over on twitch.tv/MrGM every single day. And with that, guys, I'll see you next time.